Right, thanks for coming. Let's hear it for brains. Hey. Where do we start? So, the tree of life, magnificent. I don't have to sensitize you to the beauty of this wonderful tree, but this little noise you're hearing is parasites gnawing at the roots and branches of the tree of life. And apparently, parasitologists have estimated that this may have been going on for quite a bit of time, actually very early on in the evolution of life, and possibly up to 500 millions of years ago. Parasites trying to manipulate their hosts and their host behavior. So what are the fruits of these morbid tree of life and parasites? I mean, just a few examples you might be familiar with. There's the evil fungus zombifying the ant, make it climb the leaf and blah blah. There's the insidious worm parasitizing the cricket, and in this case it's not about predation but it's about spreading, so the cricket jumps into the water and releases the parasite. There's the sadistic wasp parasitizing and zombifying cockroaches and using them for reproduction. So there's a lot going on, right? There's rabies. It's an interesting case, and I will have a bit more to say about rabies later on. And then my favorite example today, which is going to be the stuff of your nightmares tonight. This is, Leukoclodium Paradoxim. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it right. The bulging eyes are actually brood sacs of the parasite, which lodges in the eyes of the snails, okay? And when there is light, it pulsates like yellow and green, resembling, if you notice, a little caterpillar. So the bird, which is the next host, will be more likely to predate on the snail. This is really horrifying. But there's something more horrifying about it. Something I found, I need to get it off my system. Are you familiar with Rule 34? Who is familiar with Rule 34? So the rule states that if it exists, there's going to be porn on it. And I'm sorry to say that in searching for pictures to use, there's apparently a very weird subgenre of these kind of things. I don't recommend it. Don't look it up. Don't draw it. Okay. And let's forget about it. Okay? Never said anything about it. So these are just a few selections of what parasites can do to manipulate behavior in various ways. But there's thousands of parasites that can potentially have behavior manipulation effects. And again, this has been going on for a long time. So the question becomes, that if this is the case, it's quite plausible to hypothesize there must have been a relentless selection over many millions of years for countermeasures and ways to at least try to resist manipulation or fight back against manipulation. So the brains we have today might carry the history of a very long history of manipulation attempts, countermeasures, and parasite responses too. And the first question is, of course, now we can ask which features of brain functioning actually are or used to be anti-manipulation mechanisms. This is a very compelling question the moment you start to ask it, and no one has really gone there so far. Okay, we'll see some reasons why, because it's going to be really tricky real soon. And of course, if we can figure out some of the possible anti-manipulation features of the brain, we can start wondering about the implications. Okay, and this is work in progress, so I'm working on a paper right now, and the reason for presenting this is to essentially get the ball rolling, and you will see it's very, present you with the question, frame it, give you a few hunches I'm working on, and then hopefully get some feedback from some of you. All right, so the first step, I think, is to start thinking theoretically. So we know quite a bit about what parasites do. Strategies of parasite, the mechanisms that parasites use, there's been a lot of work on that. So we can start from there and make reasonable hypotheses about what's the menu, the possible menu of anti-manipulation strategies. It's a new topic, so there's a lot of, it's going to be a lot of exploration and speculation involved. and you want to pull together insights, not just from neurobiology and evolutionary biology, but also from computer science. Folks have been working quite a bit on information warfare, what you do to protect communication pathways and signaling pathways. And even I find useful to refer to strategy and war styles. So it's a very interesting new topic. Here's my proposal. So there seems to be 5 basic ways you could be resisting manipulation attempts. First, I can keep them out, okay? You can restrict access to the systems. And there are some, you could have physical barriers, but there are subtler ways to do it. For example, you could, there's some proteins or glycans or molecules that parasites can use to get entrance into some brain regions, and you could, for example, stop expressing those molecules or evolve different versions over time. You can make it costly, so increase, for example, the metabolic cost of signaling. For example, you require more neurotransmitters, more. So it just increase the cost in any way you can. Or you can increase the potential fitness cost of trying to hijack your system by using toxin compounds. I'll talk about this in a minute. The other strategy, this is where it becomes really, really interesting from a brain function perspective, is you can make it complex. You can increase not the metabolic cost, but the computational complexity of your signals. Make it harder to read them, eavesdrop, hijack them, and reproduce them. And interesting enough, at least at the scales at which microparasites will work, there's going to be quite a bit of overlap between the two, because of course more computation is going to require also more energy use and more complexity in the cells and so forth. So there might be an overlap between these two. You can make it robust. So increase robustness, for example, with feedback systems, multiple layers, redundancy, okay, in a passive way. But more speculatively, you could actually be on the lookout, okay? Try to detect manipulation attempts. You may have some active system that detect when something's not quite right in your brain signaling, and maybe enact some response strategies. You could call these active robustness. Well, so the history is long, and there's reason to believe that when your brains are small and simple, you're more open to manipulation attempts. So some of these countermeasures, if they exist, are going to be pretty ancient, with 3 main consequences. So the first, some of these countermeasures may be embedded into very basic neuroendocrine mechanisms. So things that we think are kind of just the way brains work might actually reflect some early fights between parasites and hosts. Some of them may have actually become useless over time. And paradoxically, this happens most likely to the most effective defenses. Okay? If you can mount an especially wonderful defense against one specific kind of manipulation, it might just pay off for the parasite to stop doing that and try something else entirely. Okay? But you might be stuck with a countermeasure if it becomes kind of frozen in your brain functioning. And then, of course, a lot of those mechanisms, given the amount of time that has passed, might have been partially recycled or modified to serve other purposes. So if you put all these 3 together, depending on your personality, you may see something, oh, this is the most exciting thing possible, like, oh, or, okay, this is hopeless, let's go home, it's just, you never get anywhere. And both are probably true in a sense, okay, so this makes the topic, I think, extremely fascinating, and at the same time, very complicated to deal with in practice. But we can try and see how far we go. And what I'm going to do now is to very briefly tell you a few interesting points about brain functioning that might or might not be related to parasite countermeasures. And this is all speculative and just throwing them out as possibilities. So first thing, well, dopamine, just think about dopamine. So this is one molecule, it's a very important molecule, and a very common manipulation target from parasites. Of course, regulates many motivational systems, including exploration, even sexuality and mating. So if you can control dopamine, you can control a lot of interesting things. Well, one thing about dopamine you might not know is actually a pretty toxic thing. So it's unstable, it's an unstable molecule, and when it breaks down, it actually damages DNA, damages proteins. So as a molecule, it's not the safest molecule you can think of. Actually, it's pretty dangerous to produce, dangerous to store. And so the possibility is that, so maybe, that's a feature, not a bug. Okay? And of course, I mean, parasites have a long time to deal with this, and you can think, well, parasites may actually evolve tolerance, so they may evolve the means to safely store dopamine, and some bacteria, for example, can produce quite a bit of dopamine without adverse consequences. But one thing that happens more frequently is that parasites will not attempt to synthesize dopamine themselves, but just to tell the host to, for example, produce dopamine, or interfere with the signaling system in other ways. It gets better. Turns out, well, it's not just dopamine, okay? So catecholamines, they are molecules that together regulate bacterial growth, but also many neuropeptides actually have antimicrobial properties. And the question that arises from here, I mean, there's a number of possibilities, but is it possible that neurotransmitters have preferentially evolved from toxic substances? I mean, that would be a nice way to try to keep parasites out of your signaling system with relatively little cost. And so you wonder if some of the very basic features of how the brain works are, in a way, reflecting the legacy of ancient chemical warfare that's been going on and possibly still going on. Complexity. There's many, many ways we could go about it. I'm just pointing out two interesting features of brain function that, again, might have something to do with it. So one thing is, many hormones and neurotransmitters are not secreted in a continuous, on a continuous level, but in pulses. Not just any kind of pulse, the timing has to be right. So what you have is basically a kind of frequency encoding. Why is that so? Well, we don't really know very well, okay? So you can model it, and one thing that this kind of system does is it's a bit more robust to noise, because it's discrete, it's kind of digital, and also possibly more energy efficient, but that really depends a lot on the assumptions you put in the model. What I would just point out as a beginning of some thinking about it is, well, that also would make it more difficult to mimic for parasites. Just think about it from the perspective of a bacterium, okay? You can just coordinate and secrete kind of constant level of neurotransmitters, but how you reproduce pulses with the right timing, it just becomes more difficult to hijack and reproduce. Similar, one thing that's become a big thing in neuroscience is the core-release of neurotransmitters at the synapses. So it turns out even synapses where there's one main neurotransmitter, there's usually more than one being secreted, and you have fine-tuning of the synaptic effects. There's, of course, increased flexibility when you have multiple neurotransmitters that together create the effect you want to create. But at the same time, it's a computationally complex code. How do you crack it? How do you reproduce it? It just becomes much, much more difficult to do. And interesting enough, some parasites have been known, for example, parasitic wasps, they don't manipulate hosts with one chemical. They secrete these cocktails of chemicals that can be dozens of molecules altogether. Well, that's not good if you can do it, but it definitely imposes a burden that's not just chemical, but also computational on the parasites. All right, and if you take this to the extreme consequences, and this is purely speculative, maybe we're exploiting developmental noise or genetic noise. Okay, instead of suppressing it, maybe we can exploit it to create some kind of random, personalized variation in the balance of neurotransmitters, in the timing of the pulses, and make the code even harder to break in this way. Who knows? Okay, and then you can basically do what I'm proposing is to do the same kind of exploratory work for each of these strategies, and then think about how are the parasites likely to respond, and then try to look for comparative evidence and experimental evidence of possible counter-manipulation functions of this mechanism. Okay, so if it works out, here's a couple of implications that I think are very interesting. First implication, countermeasures, of course, can be costly and can be also messy in a number of ways. And there's one trend in neuroscience that is to emphasize efficiency in neural design, how everything is streamlined for maximum efficiency, and that's clearly one important pressure. But if this is true, you might have some interesting limits and constraints on that. And some of that might not be very obvious. Actually, some aspect of brain function, that's the thing that really gets me super excited, may actually not make sense if you don't think of the parasite manipulation as a pressure on them. So you're thinking, why is this, doing this? And you think about the brain as kind of this internally consistent system, okay? And some features might just not be, that's not the right place to look. The right place to look is parasites trying to hijack the system from the outside. Well, the brain is designed to resist manipulation attempts. If that is true, it doesn't make a difference between hostile manipulation and beneficial manipulations. For example, you want to treat mental disorders, sometimes it's pretty hard to figure out how to, the drugs don't work very well, maybe the effects work for a while and then there's rebounds. And so it's, especially for some behavior systems, it's actually pretty hard to manipulate the brain for, beneficial reasons. And if this line of reasoning goes anywhere, we might be able to identify some critical nodes where the resistance is concentrated, but also potentially if the brain actually has some detection mechanisms that detect that manipulation is occurring and maybe tone them down or disconnect some systems or whatever defense mechanism, by just giving drugs in a kind of non-specific way, we might be inadvertently triggering this response mechanism. So if they are there, that's an interesting place to look for increasing the effectiveness of interventions. And third, in any other conference, it would be great news, right? And so it's like, oh, bummer. Or no, we're great zombies. So what do I mean by this? Okay, so don't shoot the messenger, okay? Unless the messenger looks like this, and just shoot. Quick. Okay, so I don't think there's very clear evidence of sophisticated manipulation in humans. Okay, the toxoplasma case, the evidence I think is very conflicting. Okay, there's some reports, but the studies are kind of and then there's some big studies that don't really show much of an effect. They haven't been replicated properly. So I would put a question mark on the toxoplasma thing. But see, even the specificity of the effect seems to kind of be diluted from mice to cat to humans. So it's not you don't find this kind of really cool specific manipulation syndrome where you really zombify the animal and make it do whatever you want to do, climb up a tree and we don't do that, okay? So this is actually an interesting question. All the really cool zombification examples are for very small animals. And one possible thing here is that scale may actually be playing an important role. And the working hypothesis is that simpler brains and smaller brains are actually, they have more metabolic constraints. You can't build a lot of redundancy in them. They might be easier to manipulate in a sophisticated way. And humans with our big, complex brain may actually be pretty resistant to that. There are other reasons, too. And then the interesting exceptions, I think, is rabies. Because that's the one thing that, it's actually able, even humans, to reproduce a kind of reasonably coherent and specific form of manipulation. And in this case, it's not a large parasite. It's actually a pretty small virus. So I'm calling it provisionally the rabies paradox, which also makes an excellent title for a sequel. See you in 2020. All right. I think we have time for one question. Yes.
You argue that humans are not good candidates for getting parasitized and
zombified.
Zombified, yeah. And I guess my question is, if we think about when humans will do crazy stuff like climb up into trees or suicide bombing, et cetera, they're zombified by ideas.
Yes.
Right? And so would these similar kinds of principles apply to zombification by ideas
right.
zombification by physical parasites?
It's it's a wonderful question, and you know it. Yes. So in a way, some of the same principles would apply. At the same time, first, I think some of the constraints might be quite specific to, for example, metabolic constraints, the kind of neurocomplexity constraints. That might be something that just, at some point, the computational power of big brain, if you're a small parasite, you can't do much about it. And maybe you can manipulate in very non-specific ways, but you can't really hijack such a complex system. To do that, you would need to do a lot of computation inside of you. But if you're small, there's going to be pretty strict limits on what you can do computationally. So it's like try to hijack the NASA supercomputer with a C64. Okay, it works in movies, but not in real life. For ideas, some of the same principles might apply. You can also think ideas maybe are a bit more of a novel problem, because brains have dealt with some zombification strategies for millions and millions of years. And ideas, especially in modern societies where ideas kind of move around more freely, there's a bit less of kind of social control and conservatism about what ideas are around. We might be facing some kind of slightly novel form of manipulation. So yeah, It's very interesting. We can talk more about that. Okay. Thank you so much.